And now we're going to get into part 3 to finish our study of the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 18, God basically reminds Aaron of the terms of his agreement as priest. Number 1, my summary is every problem that comes to the house of God is your problem. Every offense, every sin, every issue is your responsibility to deal with. And number 2, every blessing that comes to the house of God is yours. Every gift, every sacrifice, every offering that is devoted to the Lord but not burned in the fire is yours. I give it to you as your portion. Everything in Israel that is devoted to the Lord is yours. I give it to you and your sons and your daughters as your perpetual share. It's an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for you and your children. And in verse 21, he says, I give to the Levites all of the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. You see, basically, God's telling them, I don't want your focus to be on shepherding animals, raising crops, doing the work to feed and clothe your family. I want your focus to be on me and my house. And then in return, I'm going to provide for you everything that you need from what comes into my house. Basically, you take care of my business, Aaron, and I'll take care of yours. And I think we as priests and kings in Christ have that same privilege and responsibility. This is a godly ordinance that even the Apostle Paul restates in the New Testament. Now, it doesn't always work like this in every single case. We know that, like, often the Apostle Paul would work as a tent maker to support himself. And then he would go into the temple on the Sabbath to preach the gospel. But the Bible also tells us that eventually others would come to work and support Paul so that he could devote himself full time to preaching the gospel. Likewise, since the beginning of Freedom Church, our pastor has always worked a job to support his family, while at the same time doing double duty to carry out all the work of the church. And in the same way, we always look forward to the time when the church can support Pastor Israel and his family so that then he can devote himself full time to ministry. And one thing we know for sure, God provides all things in his time. Now, chapter 20 presents us with a very different kind of problem. For the first time, we're faced with a blatant failure of leadership. Now, you know it's a problem if a church worker does something dumb, but it's entirely different if a pastor goes off the rails. Verse 1 tells us in chapter 20 that they arrived in the desert of Zin. It mentions that Moses' sister Miriam had died and was buried there, but it's more of a side note. It's not really related to the story at hand. So they're in the desert of Zin, and they find themselves without a source of water. Now, I would tell you that you won't believe what they said, but at this point, you could probably guess what they did. They said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Man, oh man, don't you know God is listening? Don't you know he's ready to act when you complain against him? And even more than that, haven't you learned yet that he's even more eager to act when you place your trust in him? But God is merciful and kind. And instead of giving the people what they deserve, he told Moses to get the staff and go speak to the rock, and it would pour out water. And that's where the trouble starts. You see, unfortunately, Moses became very angry with the people. And in his anger, he struck the rock with the staff instead of speaking to it the way the Lord commanded. The Lord responded in verse 12, and he said, because you didn't trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Hey, Mo, you don't get to enter the promised land. Now, does that seem harsh? It is harsh. It's a harsh reminder of the truth of God. To whom much is given, much is required. You might remember in the New Testament, two of Jesus' disciples thought they were ready to share in the honor of the Messiah. It was the two brothers, James and John, the sons of thunder, right? They said, hey, we want to sit on your right and left hand in your kingdom. And Jesus said, are you ready to pay the price that I have to pay? Are you ready to make the sacrifice that I have to make? They said, oh, yes, Lord, we're ready. But when the time came for Christ to pay the price, they ran. When Jesus said, if any of you would come after me, you must first deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me, he wasn't exaggerating the point. Carrying your cross symbolizes your death. If the followers of Christ must die to themselves, how much more the leaders of the followers? For me personally, I have a few concerns about being a pastor, but this one is definitely at the top of the list. Honestly, I don't want any authority or power or anything that God hasn't given me, because I need his grace to handle it right. And if I don't handle it right, I'm going to be held accountable, just like Moses was. I mean, not that I'm in any way Moses, but still the same point, I'm going to be held accountable for what I'm given. And ever since I was a teenager, my prayer has been Psalms chapter 30. And it sounds a little bit abrupt, but just you'll get the idea as we step through this. Verse 2 starts, I'm too stupid to be human, and I lack common sense. I have not mastered human wisdom, nor do I know the Holy One. What's the psalmist saying here? It's a poetic way of saying, man, I thought I was smart, but I realize how foolish I am. And that's where I'm coming from. Then in verse 5, it says, every word of God proves true. He's a shield to all who come to him for protection. Basically, it's okay that I'm a pumpkinhead, because God will even protect me from myself if I surrender to him and put my trust in him. Verse 6, do not add to his words, or he may rebuke you and expose you as a liar. So you think you want to be a teacher? You better be careful to teach what God says, or he's going to judge you openly. And then bouncing down to verse 7, he says, oh God, I beg 2 favors from you, and let me have them. First, help me never to tell a lie. And second, and here's the key point for me, he says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Give me just enough to satisfy my needs. For if I grow rich, I may forget you. And if I'm too poor, I may steal and thus insult God's holy name. The bottom line here is, I see my heart, and I know that I can't be trusted with too little or too much, but I trust God to give me the right amount. And he always does. He knows what he's doing, and I trust him to lead me and guide me and bless me accordingly. Leadership definitely has its rewards, and it most certainly has its responsibilities. And God takes them both very seriously. And Moses learned this firsthand when he disobeyed God's command at the rock of Meribah, and he lost the opportunity to enter into the promised land. After this event, where Moses and Aaron disobey God, Aaron dies, and the priesthood is passed on to his son, Eleazar. The account of his death is summed up in 8 verses. But what strikes me is this. Basically, Aaron is bebopping along through the wilderness, and God says, hey, Mo, get Aaron and Eleazar and take them up to the top of the mountain and put Aaron's priestly clothes on his son, because Aaron's going to die. Moses does what God said, and boom, Aaron dies right there while the three of them are on top of the mountain. And Aaron finished his last assignment. He laid down, went to sleep, and woke up in the presence of the Lord. And I think that's a pretty cool way to end it. So, I mean, I always used to kind of focus on the fact that he lost the opportunity to go into the promised land. But I just got a sneaking suspicion that when he woke up in the presence of the Lord, he didn't really care so much anymore. I think he kind of looked up at God and said, "Oh, I get it. This is way better." So now in Numbers chapter 21, we see a turning of the tide. The death of Aaron marks the beginning of the end of the wilderness travels. The Israelites begin to make their way from the wilderness where they've been wandering to the region above the Dead Sea across the Jordan River from Jericho. As soon as they set out, they encounter a Canaanite king who comes out to attack them for no reason. The Canaanites captured some of the Israelites and they take them away. But God gave the Israelites victory over the Canaanites, and they were completely destroyed. The Hebrews continue north, but they have to take a long, hard route instead of the easy route through the Edomite territory, because the Edomites won't let them pass through the Edomite land. Now, this is a very difficult and very discouraging development for the Israelites. But in light of their fantastic recent victory, what do you think they did? Oh, you'll never guess. They complained. What? Of course they did. How did you guess that? And in typical Israelite fashion, they not only complained about what they didn't have, they complained harshly about what God had provided for them. They felt like they had already struggled enough. You hearing that? Doesn't that sound like somebody that you saw in the mirror one day? They felt like they had already struggled enough. In their opinion, their trial should really be over. And they wanted to make sure that God and Moses understood that it was time for the struggle to be over. I don't know, but that sounds a little bit like me on a certain bad day. So they communicated that through complaining. And in response to their complaining, the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. And the snakes bit the people and made them very sick. Many of them died. Right away, the people wised up and they said, "Oh, we sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Please pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So the Lord gave Moses a very strange instruction. He said, "Make a bronze snake." Now remember what bronze is used for in the Old Testament? It represents judgment, right? He said, "Make a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made the serpent and he put it on a pole. And amazingly, all the people had to do was look at the serpent and believe that it was what God had provided for their salvation, and they would be saved. What an amazing idea. Jesus tells us in in John chapter 3, Jesus doesn't do any talking that I know of in Numbers chapter 3. But in John chapter 3, Jesus tells us, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And later in John chapter 12, he says, "And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." So Jesus tells us very, very clearly that the serpent represents him. Why was the serpent made of bronze? It's of representing judgment. It's because Jesus took the judgment that we deserve by hanging on the wooden cross, just as the serpent hung on the wooden pole in Numbers chapter 21. But here's the catch. It's like, why would God use a serpent to represent Jesus? We saw in Genesis that the serpent was judged by God because he deceived Eve. In the same way, Jesus literally fell under God's judgment for our sin. That's the key right there. Jesus didn't just take the hit. He was literally accused, convicted, and punished for our sin. And God documented all of this in his amazing book that we're studying so that we can recognize the Messiah when he comes, so we can recognize him when he calls to us, and when he calls us to himself. So the Lord continues to lead his people north. Along the way, they encounter two more kings, just like the last king. These two kings are also more powerful than the Israelites. Yet God gives the Israelites complete victory over their enemy. In Numbers chapter 22, the Israelites have arrived in the plains of Moab, along the Jordan River, across from that famous city called Jericho. And here we find what is arguably the strangest story in the entire Bible. If you guys know of a stranger one, you're going to have to point it out, but you got to wait until we get done hearing about this one, because I think this one takes the cake. All right. Here we read about Balak, king of Moab, and he has heard about the amazing victories of the Israelites, and he's filled with dread, and so are all of his people. Remember a few minutes ago when we talked about the 10 spies, and we said that they felt like grasshoppers compared to their enemies, and indeed we seem like grasshoppers to them? Well, here it is. They didn't seem like grasshoppers at all. Their enemy was scared to death. I ask you, what could be more scary than facing a giant enemy who looks like this? Well, here's what I say. I say it would be even scarier to face an enemy who looks like this after you just watched him demolish 3 enemies that look like this. Exactly. And that's what this king Balak was seeing in the Israelites. The Israelites looked like this little guy over here in the left, and they just defeated these 3 massive, massive armies of huge, literal giants. And Balak saying, whoa. Once you see something like this, you know there's more going on here than meets the eye. So Balak is scared to death, and he decides to hire somebody to level the field. Who does he hire? Balaam. Balaam is a Mesopotamian Baru. Now, Mesopotamia is the area that he was from, also called Chaldea, the same land that God called Abraham out of. Remember Ur of the Chaldeans? That was Abraham's land. Well, Chaldea and Mesopotamia, same land. And he was called a Baru. A Baru was an oracle-speaking priest, a diviner. He read omens and he declared truths based on omens that he read. And people would hire him to bless what they wanted blessed or curse what they wanted cursed, because he had a reputation that whatever he said actually came to pass. As a kid, I really struggled with Balaam because my mind saw things in black and white, good or bad, up and down, you know? Basically, if you know God, you love him and you follow him. And so Balaam, he never made sense to me. But now I understand that there are many shades of gray in between. Balaam was a man who had been given a measure of faith so that he knew God, but he didn't love him. He followed God, but only for personal gain. He didn't trust God to have, let me say it this way. Balaam didn't trust God to have Balaam's best interest at heart. Now, here's an interesting fact. Balaam is mentioned 59 times in the Bible. There's more said about Balaam in the Bible than is said about Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's even more said about Balaam than was said about any of the apostles of Christ. Isn't that interesting? So King Balak sends men to hire Balaam to curse Israel. And Balaam says, look, man, I can't curse Israel unless God curses Israel. And God told Balaam that Israel is simply not cursed, but instead Israel is blessed. And he tells Balaam, just send these guys away. King Balak, later on, he sent even more men with more money to try to entice Balaam to come and curse Israel. But God tells Balaam that he can go with the men, but he warns him, do only what I tell you to do. And now here is where the story gets bizarre. Balaam begins the journey with the men, and God sees his heart, and he knows that his heart is not devoted to God. In fact, his heart is greedy, and he really wants all that money that King Balak is offering him. So God sends an angel to stand in Balaam's way. Balaam can't see the angel, but the donkey that he's riding can see the angel. So the donkey avoids the angel. 3 times the angel appeared and the donkey avoided the angel. The first time, the donkey turned off the road into a field, and Balaam got angry and beat the donkey to get the donkey back on the road. The second time, the angel stood in a narrow path, and so the donkey pressed close to the wall, and he crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. So Balaam got angry again and beat the donkey again. The third time, the angel stood in a very narrow place where there was no room to turn, no way for the donkey to get past him. So since he had no other choice, the donkey just lay down underneath Balaam. And Balaam was furious, and he beat his donkey for a third time. At this point, God does a miracle, and he gives the donkey the ability to speak in human language. The donkey questions Balaam. He says, what have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times? Now, how do you like my donkey impersonation? You didn't know I knew how to talk like a donkey, did you? Or maybe you did. So Balaam answered the donkey. Now, if it's not crazy enough for you that the donkey's talking, now this guy's talking back to the donkey, okay? Does anybody remember that old TV show called Mr. Ed? And his human friend, Wilbur. Well, that's exactly what we got going on here. Okay, Mr. Ed happening in real life. So Balaam answers his donkey. He says, donkey, you've made a fool out of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now. And in verse 30, the donkey says to Balaam, am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? And have I been in the habit of doing this to you? And Balaam responded, no. So not only is this guy having an argument with this donkey, but the donkey just won the argument. Come on, you guys. And just then, the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low, and he fell face down. And the angel of the Lord asked him, why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is reckless before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. And if it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now. But I would have spared the donkey. So, quick summary of what's going on here. Man argues with donkey. Donkey wins the argument. Angel spanks man with his own flip-flop. Come on, people. Anybody tries to tell me the book of Numbers is boring has simply not read the book. So what did Balaam say? He said the same thing that we all say when mama comes at us with the chancleta. He said, I have sinned. And the angel of the Lord is like, yeah, good call. Now go see this king, but only say what I tell you to say. So King Balak brings Balaam and all of his people up a mountain to a very high place where they can look out over the entire Israelite camp. Now, do you remember what they see when they look down over the camp? They see a giant cross with the tabernacle at the heart of it, and the Shekinah presence of God above the camp in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. King Balak told Balaam to curse the Israelites, but instead, Balaam blessed them. Balak told him again to curse the Israelites, but for the second time, he blessed them. That happened even a third time. And finally, King Balak couldn't take it anymore. In chapter 24, verse 10, we read where he says, Then Balak's anger burned against Balaam, and he struck his hands together, and he said to him, I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them 3 times. Now leave at once and go home. I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded. Balaam answered Balak, Didn't I tell the messengers that you sent, even if King Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything of my own accord, good or bad, to go beyond the command of the Lord? I must say only what the Lord says. Then Balaam returned home, or so he said. But he didn't actually go home. And what actually happened is difficult to understand if you just kind of breeze through Numbers and Deuteronomy. But if you look closely, you can see what happened. What he actually did was he doubled back to King Balak, and he told King Balak a terrible secret. You see, Balaam couldn't curse Israel because God was blessing them. But Balaam told King Balak, you can do something where I don't have to curse them. You can do something where God will curse them. Send your women into the camp to seduce the men of Israel and teach them to worship your gods. Make sure that your women don't stop until the Israelite men have bowed down and prayed to those idols, and God will curse them for you. You see, Balaam taught the Moabites how to get the Israelites to curse themselves. The Bible calls that a stumbling block. He put something in front of them that they tripped over, and God takes that very, very seriously. So seriously that in Revelation chapter 2, now this is 1,000 years later, Balaam is remembered as the greatest stumbling block in the history of Israel. That incident of what Israel did and how God dealt with it is recorded in Numbers chapter 25. In Numbers 27, Joshua becomes the leader in place of Moses. Remember, ever since Joshua was young, he was a faithful servant to Moses. The next few chapters outline the necessary offerings and festivals that are required to be observed. In Numbers chapter 31, God directs Moses to take vengeance on the Midianites because they followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord. Chapter 33 details every single place that the Israelites camped on their journey, from Egypt to the Promised Land. Chapter 34 lays out the boundaries of the inheritance for each tribe. Chapter 35 details more instructions for how to live, including cities of refuge, which I'm not going to cover in this Bible study, but it is a very interesting concept to learn about. And the last chapter, chapter 36, is super interesting to me. There's a tribal leader who has no son, only daughters. And God makes provisions for them to gain an inheritance in the promised land. Even though women were not allowed to inherit property from their fathers, God provided for them. Our God is a God of details, and he loves all of his children. So now please remember, the promised land is over here where you see the gold star. But all this action is taking place over here where you see the white star. Now, 2.5 tribes of Israel get an idea to change up the plans a little. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh had very large herds of flocks and animals. They wanted to stay in the land. God had already given them, this is the land where the white star is over here. This is the land that God had already given them victories and stuff. And they wanted to stay there because it was good for raising flocks and herds. They asked Moses if they could stay there. So Moses put a very serious verbal smackdown on them. And he basically said, look, the only way you're going to avoid judgment from God is if you arm yourselves for battle and fight alongside your brothers over there where the gold star is. Then you can come back to this land once your brothers are established on the other side of the Jordan. Everyone agreed, and they were back on track again. The book ends with the new generation of the children of Israel in the plains of Moab, here on the bank of the Jordan River, overlooking the city of Jericho. In the first census, the total number of men over the age of 20 was 603,550. There are only 2 men left from the original census, Joshua and Caleb. The total number of men over 20 in the second census is 601,730. That's a net loss of 1,820 men. It's statistically equivalent. Basically, it's a net zero population growth. Now, every Christian is on a journey of maturity, sanctification, sonship, or daughtership. For some, that journey has been pleasant. But for most, I think we would say that that journey has been marked by pain, discouragement, suffering, disillusionment, struggle. Sometimes we feel like we're wandering. As we make this journey, what should we learn? Let me give you 3 takeaways from the book of Numbers. First of all, complaining is contagious. You're going to mess up the whole thing if you come in and start complaining. And number 2, doubt is disastrous.
Disaster.
It was for them. Their corpses fell in the wilderness. Let me say this. If you're bent on doing it your way and not letting God be your Lord, it's going to hurt a lot more than any trouble you might find on the journey to heaven. And number 3, walking is better than wandering. These people turned an 11-day dream into a 40-year nightmare. It's always better to walk by faith than to wander by fear. If you're facing something that seems so big, don't go back. Don't turn back. Go forward. Keep walking. Keep believing. Keep trusting. And watch what God is going to do. He's going to do something. The story isn't over yet. But don't wallow in the wilderness, wandering aimlessly for years. Keep walking the path of faith. God has good things for you. He really does. And he is powerful enough to get you there. Even though we make mistakes along the way and we fail along the way, God's grace is powerful enough to forgive, to heal, to restore. He'll get us there. The only thing that stops him is if we stop. Keep walking in faith. Keep trusting God to get you there. I close again with the blessing found in Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.